Okay.
Recording started.
All right. Let me share my screen real quick. Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming to our first virtual meetup for Austin blockchain technology and Austin Hyperledger. We're super excited that we get to do it in this format because we can reach a broader audience, obviously. And we're even able to have some international presence tonight, which is super exciting. So thanks for hanging out with us for a little bit this evening, getting information. We want to thank our sponsors first. Of course, Capital Factory is normally our physical sponsor, but they're allowing us to do it on this virtual space as well. They're a super cool place for startups, entrepreneurs, and just kind of a funky place to hang out. So check them out if you haven't. Your host for this evening, I'm Monica Jones from HempChain. I'm the CMO, and Mark Morris is also on here. He's our founder, CEO, technology guru. And we are excited about this because we are truly blockchain for enterprise. We use Hyperledger Fabric and Sawtooth for the industrial hemp industry, which is burgeoning, thankfully. And so if you guys have any questions about what we've got going on, we've got a bunch of international, national things. Find us on any of the social medias or our emails there, but we're pretty easy to find. So please connect with us. And of course, the Linux Foundation, which allows us to have this community. And they have graciously given us $75 to raffle off at the end. So everybody that's on, I'll put in a bowl and we'll pull a name so that we can get you a shopping spree on their online store. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce David. He's here from Hyperledger. And he's going to give us an update on what they've got going on for 2020, which is by far the strangest year I've lived through so far. So it'll be nice to see what they're kind of doing with this. And then I figured if there's any questions or chat with his update, we pause for a little bit and go through that, see if there's anything else you want to address. And then we'll have our co-chairs for the special interest group for climate change and accounting. We have Martin and Tom. Martin is coming to us from Open Lab at Yale, and he is one of the co-chairs, and then as is Tom. And Tom's resume was so full that I couldn't even boil it down. So basically he's a startup guru and is involved in everything climate change. So if there's anything else you want to add later, Tom, please feel free. I didn't know what to highlight. But anyway, I'll hand it off to David now, and he can give us the Hyperledger update. That's the end of mine.
Great, thank you, Monica. Well, I'll just introduce myself really quickly, and I'll say that it's nice to be virtually part of Austin. I lived in Austin for a number of years. I went to University of Texas and loved living there, and one day when we're allowed to travel, I'll certainly be back, and maybe we can do an in-person meetup as well as the virtual one today. So, but thank you for having me. And as Monica said, I wanted to do an update on what has been happening with Hyperledger in 2020. And then, of course, if people have any questions, I'm happy to answer. So let me just share my screen first. OK, let me know if you all are able to see that.
Looks good.
Great.
We are.
Great. So people may know the basics, but I'll just go over a very brief intro before we start talking about what has happened with Hyperledger this year. Hyperledger is one of the open source projects hosted by the Linux Foundation. It was started a little over 4 years ago. The Linux Foundation saw that blockchain was going to be an important new technology and wanted to make sure that there was going to be an open, an accessible, free alternative out in the market. And so it started the Hyperledger project. Since then, it has grown dramatically. There are now a number of projects that started with one project 4 years ago and has grown now, and we'll get into a little bit of the details later about how that's grown. And the projects that have come into the community have really been maturing. So you can see on the slide, there are a number of production level releases. There are 3 1.0 releases and 1 2.0 releases. In addition to the projects, we have a number of active community groups, which again, Martin and Tom will be talking about the climate action and accounting SIG after I'm done, but that's just one of many different activities happening in the group. And we're part of one of the Hyperledger meetups. So thank you again for having me. And Hyperledger Austin is one of the meetups in our worldwide meetup community. There are over 170 other. And with the switch to virtual meetups, it is a unique opportunity. You know, you don't have to be in a city now anymore to take part in a meetup being hosted. So if you're interested or curious about what's going on in other parts of the world with Hyperledger, please feel free to dial into any other virtual meetups that are being hosted, and we'd love to have you. So with that, I'll get into some more of the details. So Hyperledger is not just one thing, it is a number of things, what we call a greenhouse. Sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat to make sure there's no issues. Okay, sorry. So Hyperledger, we call it a greenhouse. So there's a number of things happening in the community. Again, it's not just one thing, there are a number of different things. And as a greenhouse, the goal is to plant a number of seeds and have them grow and mature over time. And so we can talk a little bit more in a minute about how individuals or organizations can come to the community, bring a new idea, such as a new project or a new group, and really have that grow and flourish and thrive alongside the other activities that are happening in the community. So this is a image of the current state of the projects. And the next time I have an opportunity to talk to you, this may change. This is a growing, changing ecosystem, and there are things that show up and become new projects. And again, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But you can see here that in the community, there's a number of set of things. One, we have 6 of these distributed ledger platforms that people use. Again, this is all free open source software. Anybody, anywhere can take the code, build on top of it, and we can show you some examples of how people are doing that in a minute. In addition to these different distributed ledgers, there's also some libraries and tools and some other resources in the community that can help you with the projects that you want to build. And in terms of what is happening recently, there, as I said before, a lot of the projects are maturing. And you can see here that within the last few months in 2020, Hyperledger Fabric has had a 2.0 release that went live in January. And there's a number of features there. I can share these slides out after. Monica, if you have the chance to share it to everybody who RSVP'd, all these links here are live, and we'll take you to blog posts and wiki pages that will give you more details. So if you're really interested in what is included in these latest release, you can just click on these links. And then Hyperledger BOSWELL, one of our newest projects, had a 1.4 release, also that happened earlier this year in February, and it also included a number of new features. So let me just speak briefly about one of our newest projects. But before I do that, I will say again that as an open source project, the Linux Foundation merely provides support. We don't provide technical direction at all. We are here only because there's a community of people, individuals and organizations around the world who want to show up and contribute to the goals of the project, which is creating open source blockchain technologies. And so one of the ways that contribution looks like is people can come and contribute to an existing project, but they can also come and contribute new projects. So, periodically we do get, submission ideas for new projects, and then we have a community governing body, the technical steering committee, that will review and approve those projects. And this is one of the newest projects. This is the newest project, Hyperledger Avalon. As you can see on here, it is a ledger independent implementation of the trusted compute specification. So if that is of interest to you, again, just like all our projects, this is open, accessible. You're certainly welcome to get in. And in terms of how you contribute, I'll just say, there's a number of different options for you. All of the projects have both open mailing lists, open chat channels, no invitations needed. You can just go join the discussion, ask questions, talk to the other people in the project. There's also regular calls, just like this. There will be Zoom calls that you can dial into. And again, no invitation is needed. You can dial in. If you're interested in Avalon or any of the projects, we encourage you to go, talk, explore, see what's going on the list, on the chat, on the calls. And then that's a great way to learn more, get involved, hear from others about what's going on and get your voice. You know, one of the great things about open source is it's really in your hand. If you think something like Avalon would be useful, but you would wish it would go in a certain direction, I mean, that's what open source is about. You can go and take place and help, you know, really drive how the project evolves. And then in addition to the different technology projects, we do have a number of community groups. So, you know, the activity in the community is not just limited to the projects themselves. We also want to help drive adoption. So that's what the special interest groups are. We have a number of industry-specific groups that are looking at how blockchain technologies and Hyperledger projects are getting deployed in those different areas, and building a community around addressing challenges that industry is facing in terms of blockchain adoption. And each of these different groups will have different challenges because each industry is different. But at a high level, you know, if you are interested in a given industry, such as climate, such as education architecture, such as telecom, healthcare, we have, I believe, 9 different special interest groups at this point. Again, just like the projects, these are all open. You're welcome to get involved. And then as soon as I'm speaking, Tom and Martin will go into in depth on what the Climate Action and Accounting Group, you know, is focused on, what they're doing, and how you can get involved with them. And I'll just go through a few other resources that are new, just so you have the information. And of course, if you have any questions about this at any point, please do let me know. We do have a number of training and certification resources available. Some of the newest things are highlighted here. We do have some new online courses. Digital identity is a topic that, you know, is of interest to people, and that's what our 2 newest courses are about. You can see here there's an introduction to Hyperledger's identity solutions, Indy, Aries, and Ursa, and then a follow-up course that does a deeper dive on how to become a Hyperledger Aries developer. And then in addition to the courses, we also have certifications. And the newest certification we've launched is this Hyperledger Fabric developer certification. And then if you do want to find out the latest about how these technologies are being used, our website is a good resource for that. If you ever want to take a look, you can go to our blockchain showcase. It might be a little too hard to see on the screenshot here, but there's some filters. You can look at the type of industry the project is in, which Hyperledger project is being used, and the level of maturity of the project, and really get you know, a deep drill down into, you know, information that you're looking for. For example, if you're interested in the healthcare space and you're like, hey, what is going on here? I want to take a look. That's a good resource for you as well. And the link to that is here at the bottom of the slide. A few other updates about what has happened this year. We did have the largest Hyperledger event of the year happen in early March in Phoenix. Here's a few photos of that. It had close to 500 attendees from all over the world, ton of great content, 90+ sessions. Those were all recorded. Those are all available on our Hyperledger YouTube channel. So if you missed it, if you weren't able to go to Phoenix but really want to see, you know, some of the presentations that were there, that's all available. You know, I know that unfortunately, with, you know, everything going on with the coronavirus, some people weren't able to travel. So that's why it was important for us to record all this information and make it available. So if you were not able to go, please feel free to you know, go through that content. And then one thing to call out from the event, you know, we do have a focus on making sure that the community is inclusive and diverse. And so this is one session in particular I would encourage people to take a look at. It was done by Swetha Rapakula and Tracy Kurt. Had some great content about how do you make an open community more inclusive, more diverse. So if that is of interest to you, I think this was certainly one of the sessions I enjoyed the most, and would encourage you to take a look. And then I don't need to say too much about the Meetup community, because obviously you're part of the Meetup community. You're here at a Hyperledger Meetup. But just again, to give a shout out to all the different community members around the world who've stepped up. You know, the Linux Foundation itself is a small organization. Hyperledger just has a handful of staff helping support the project. We certainly don't have 170 people on staff. You know, all of these different Meetup groups you can see here are run by individuals in the community who are interested in helping spread the word about Hyperledger in their area, build the community, you know, where they're living. And so if that is of interest to you, if you are in an area where there's not a Hyperledger meetup, please feel free to reach out, and we're here to support you with that. So always welcome new meetup groups wherever they may be. And now that we're in this virtual world, you can certainly reach out and coordinate with other meetup groups as well who are holding their own events. And that is the big meetup, the big update for Hyperledger in 2020 with meetups. We did have to transition to an all virtual event format starting in March, and I think there have been some silver linings. As Monica said, we can, a group that's holding a meetup can now reach out and talk to more people from around the world. You don't have to be in the city where that event is taking part. So that's been a nice, silver lining to all this. And it's been exciting to, as somebody who's living in California, it's been exciting to be able to dial into an event, for example, in Pakistan, or I'm dialing into an Africa meetup tomorrow. So it's really cool to be able to interact with community members on a level that we weren't able to when the meetups were more focused on in-person events. So I do hope that at some point later this year, we'll be able to transition back to in-person meetups. But in the meantime, we're focused on having a thriving virtual meetup community. So I appreciate everybody for dialing in today, and encourage you to attend other meetups. And if you ever do want to speak at a virtual meetup, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to help you schedule that. As well, if you go to a meetup and you have any highlights that you want to share, we do have a mailing list for meetups. If you have a question, comment, suggestion, or you want to share something, please feel free to make use of that as well. And then I'll go through, I do want to provide just a few minutes for questions if anybody has any questions about Hyperledger before we hand things off to Tom and Martin. So I'll probably go through these slides a little bit more quickly. But I did want to just point out a few things. Very often people say, yeah, I get what you're doing. I get open source community, you're building some technology, but then the next question is, what are people doing with it? So I did want to just highlight a few different things about where we're seeing use of the Hyperledger projects. So here, for example, there was a recent report by Forbes that looked at what organizations are doing with blockchain, and it was very exciting to see that 52%, just over half of those organizations are using Hyperledger in some form of Hyperledger in some form. So here's a breakdown. And of those, it does, most of the reported uses of Hyperledger are making use of Hyperledger Fabric. So it's been exciting to see that be a very popular option for many organizations. And if you're curious, if you want to do a look at why did this organization choose this technology and what benefits do they have, we do have a case study program. These are in-depth looks at what solution a particular business is looking to fix, how they fixed it, what benefits they got, what technologies they used, why did they choose the technology that they did. We have sorry, my dog. We have a number of different case studies, this just being the most recent one. If you're curious, I would encourage you to go to the hyperledger.org website, take a look. You can take a look at this Honeywell case study as well as many others. This one I find interesting because I learned a little bit of something of this. I didn't realize that there was such a thing as a used market for a used aerospace parts market out there, but I guess that makes sense. Airplanes are built to last for a long time, and they obviously need to have updates and maintenance, and so it was really an interesting thing for me to learn about how that market worked. And it was very low tech in a way. You can see here on the quote here about the way that the used aerospace parts business had been done. It's interesting that it existed and kind of how it was managed, and really fascinating about how blockchain was able to make that work in a lot more smooth, seamless way. Again, I'm gonna go through quickly because I do want to answer some questions if there are any, but this credit union solution was also recently released, making use of Hyperledger Indy. Secure Key is another project that there's more information about on our website. This one is making use of Hyperledger Fabric. And then again, Hyperledger Fabric is one of the projects, but not all the different projects, not the only project in the community. This ScanTrust project here is making use of Hyperledger Sawtooth. And here is another sawtooth project about a blockchain securities lending platform. And apologies for scrolling through quickly. If people have questions, we can certainly take a closer look at any of this information. But that is pretty much it for now. This goes into a little bit more detail here about kind of some of the specifics of the different projects. But I won't go into all those details now. Why don't I stop and I'll just scroll through to the end to see if anybody has any questions. And I believe people may be on mute. I was muting some people earlier to avoid any background noise. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions or ask any questions in the chat. And I see a question about will slides and links be available? Yes, I will send my slides to Monica after this, and then she can send it to everybody who RSVP'd. I'll also post the recording, and that will be available on the Hyperledger YouTube channel. Any questions about any of this or about Hyperledger in general?
There's a question if you're interfacing with Web 3.0.
I'm not I'm not one of the more technical people on the team, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but I could certainly point you in the right direction. And I see here's another question about Honeywell. I'm interested in what Honeywell is doing. Used parts are huge in the airline industry, especially with older cargo planes. Yeah, here, let me find that link for you here. If people are interested in the Honeywell case study or any of these, I know that I will share the links here after the slides are available, but let me grab the link for you here. I'll put the link into the chat when Martin and Tom are speaking, but it is interesting. The case study does go into in-depth a look at that. And again, I think the case study can speak to it better than I can. I'm not an expert on that particular case study. Any other comments or questions?
Hi, this is Devin. I had one. I was typing it, but then I thought I would just come off mute and ask if that's okay.
Sure, of course.
And it may not be the right format. I'm more on the business side. I'm not a tech and rarely go into GitHub. But in any of these examples, and the question popped up when you were pointing to the tracking the meat source. But I understand block theory, philosophical, how it works, but what does each party need to really track? So you build this ledger, how do most people connect into it? Is it hard? Do people need certain software at each step of the way? Is it just a scanner and that's it? I'm just kind of curious, there's maybe, let's just say 3 to 4 players in that value chain you listed. So what does each potential company handoff need in order to make this ledger work? I'm just trying to understand that piece of it, if that's okay.
Sure, of course. And I can provide some links. Again, when Martin and Tom are speaking, I can dig up some links and point you to them. And I think the answer to your question is it really depends on the use case. So for example, if I heard part of your question was how does the data get onto the ledger, correct? So there could be different entry points. So for example, you could have some IoT devices that are automatically sending the data to a ledger and there's no human intervention involved. So like one of the case studies is, for example, in supply chain, making sure that, for example, some fish or some other items that need to be preserved within a certain temperature range actually, when they were shipped that there was some data that showed that, hey, was this fish kept chilled while it was being transported to the grocery store? And that could be, automated, if there is an IoT temperature device in the truck that's transporting that could be monitoring the temperature on a regular basis and then writing that data to a ledger. Different use cases would, perhaps have a different model. And again, I think each use case could potentially be different. There are some consumer-facing examples. So there is another supply chain example is there is a solution for tracking fair trade coffee. So as a consumer, it's important for me to know that if this bag of coffee beans says it's fair trade, that I have a way of verifying that. So in that sense, the application, the way that people interface with the application was through a smartphone app. There was a QR code on the bag of coffee beans, and then that consumer could scan the QR code and interact with the ledger that way. The ledger data could be read from the QR code and delivered to the person so they could look at the history in that sense. So, it's hard to answer that there's just one way to do it, because the different Hyperledger projects are all general purpose platforms, and different people could create different applications on it. I think what Martin and Tom will be speaking about next might also give another example about how data gets written to a ledger that might also help answer your question. That would be a climate related use case, but what they're trying to do is account for carbon emissions that are being done through a variety of different sources. And so, I would imagine they'd be able to speak to that as well. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying it depends on the use case, but hopefully that speaks to some of your what you were asking about. Any other questions? Well, that might be a good segue to Martin and Tom. I do think, I think getting some real world examples of what, is being built with Hyperledger in a given industry, will help, illustrate some of these, points a little bit more. So I'd be certainly happy to have Martin and Tom speak to that more if there weren't any other general questions about Hyperledger.
I don't think Martin's on yet. I think he's a few minutes away.
Okay. Well, let me stop my screen. We can get, Tom, I don't know if you have slides to share or not, but if you need a minute or two to get set up, please feel free to do so.
I'll give it a shot. I have my deck ready to present, but I always get a little bit worried with all my monitors to see what's going to get popped up. I'll give it a try here. So, start video. That's me. Move back.
We see you.
Hi, how you doing? And this is the name. Of course, it's the other screen. Apologies.
While you're setting that up, I'll tell everyone we are going to have our May virtual meetup, probably still virtual. Everybody's welcome to come. It's going to be William Magnuson, who is a professor of law at Texas A&M. And he has a book out, Blockchain Democracy, Technology, Law, and the Rule of the Crowd. So we'd love to have you guys here. Did that stall enough time for you?
I hope so. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can. And I think Martin just joined as well.
Excellent.
Hi, everyone.
And you can see the slide?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hey, Martin. How you doing?
Good.
I put together a basic slide deck. I don't know if you've had one that's ready that you'd like to use. Happy to switch over if you prefer.
No, this is great.
It's good. All right. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I could do the same, and happy to proceed with the presentation on your lead if you'd like.
Perfect. No, yeah, I'll introduce and then I'll let you kind of tee off. So my name is Martin Weinstein. I run the Open Innovation Lab at Yale University and other programs on climate finance and digital finance at the Digital Currency Initiative at the MIT Media Lab. The logic of the Open Lab has always been around bringing in multi-stakeholder partnerships and open innovation in the intersection with emerging digital technologies as it applies for large-scale planetary solutions to our major challenges with a focus on climate and the transformation of the energy system. As part of that, a couple of years ago, we started working on the intersection of climate and DLTs. That's how I met Tom, and we've been sort of collaborating since through different ways. You know, one of the anchor parts is the Climate Change Coalition that Tom leads. And then around kind of the later part of last year, one of the programs that we incubate at Yale that's spinning off because of scale and urgency is called Open Climate, and it's the proposal to create an integrated, transparent global climate accounting system. And part of our pilots and work that we've done already was leveraging different Hyperledger frameworks. And we noticed that there was a kind of a missing gap within the Hyperledger world on the space of climate, and perhaps underestimating how important climate accounting is and how relevant DLTs can have in it. And we were in the same wavelength. Tom was having a same view on that, and then we connected with David, and since then the three of us been helping put this together and move this forward, and that's how we both landed as co-chairs of the SIG. And I think that's just a general intro from my end. Tom, I can talk more around the complementary projects, but we could go in deeper a bit around the SIG. What are we focusing on? What's the potential going forward? How to get involved, etc.
Yep. Sounds good. I'll give a quick bio on myself. I started in climate change in the late 1990s. I was lucky enough to start working in a climate clean tech fund, pretty good sized one back then, just over $1 billion. And I was responsible for doing the due diligence on a portfolio of 160 investments. And that was about 20 years ago, the early days of sustainability standards, eco-labeling, and even the carbon markets as well. And so I focused on developing the systems of standards used in that space. And 10 years ago, I got involved in innovating the standards world itself to be better aligned with the speed of change of sustainability markets and clean tech entrepreneurs, and started to work on standards 2.0 to accelerate the pace with which those markets could grow. And it was in around 2015 that I first got involved in blockchain with a company based out of San Francisco. And in 2017 is when I helped start up the Climate Change Coalition, which is a not-for-profit, open global multi-stakeholder network. And today it has around 200 organizations in around 50 countries, all different types of stakeholders, and many different types of solutions for blockchain, often with other digital tools like IoT and so on. Ranging from the basic, let's put carbon credits on a blockchain, let's use blockchain to accelerate climate finance into climate actions, like the solutions on the ground, and that's often like low carbon solutions like renewable power and land use, whether it's smart agriculture and forestry, but it's also used in areas like adaptation to the impacts of climate change and building more resilient communities to the effects of climate and other disruptors as well, by the way. I focus most of my time outside of being involved in this SIG and similar networks, working on digital MRV, which is measurement, reporting, and verification, another term for accounting and auditing. And so over the course of a couple of years of working with all these innovators, again, from so many backgrounds and sectors and countries, of course, super exciting. but they weren't simply working on the digital innovations for climate. It was all in parallel and in context with financial innovations. Climate change is not only how do we get the emissions down, it's how do we scale the finance and put it into cleaner investments. And then in addition to financial innovations, there's governance innovation, social innovation. So these all come together in a really complex solution involving open source communities, of course, commercial interests, climate entrepreneurs, governments, and so on. And this is really matured into a sector now, or a space where this SIG in particular and others like it, it's time to add values really now to address this confluence of challenges so that it forms in a actionable system. It has the integrity, environmental integrity, the data integrity with which you can deploy the finance and resources towards the objectives of the Paris Agreement, climate goals and SDGs and so on. And so that's really what got me involved, wanting to be part of this this SIG. And so really looking forward to this evening, or for me it is on the East Coast, meetup, and to have a good discussion. So Martin, I'll just use the slides and you can speak to them as I go through.
Yeah, I think we can both kind of add context.
Right.
I don't know if David's online, he can also contribute.
Sure. So I think it might be valuable for people online who aren't super in-depth climate experts to learn a bit more about this context that drives the scope of the SIG and our mission and our activities and so on. And so, Martin, if you'd like, you can go ahead, speak to some of the context, or and I can fill in any areas that you might step over.
Yeah, and I think this slide kind of puts this sector into context, and in a responsible context, which is starting with the Paris Agreement, the most important instrument we have as a global civilization to deal with our climate. It's really what defines what's our temperature goal. That temperature goal defines what's our actual carbon budget from the atmospheric standpoint. It's also what puts every country in a leveling playing field in terms of them putting clearly what their pledges are, their nationally determined contributions. But then from there, we really have to bring in all the actors. And this is part of where climate accounting has to go through a process of evolution, because the Paris Agreement, from the point of view of the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, really caters to its constituents, which are the sovereign countries as parties to the conference. But everyone's a climate actor, individuals, companies, cities, subnational governments like provinces and states. And so it's very important, and we see now more and more the pledges that everyone is taking on, let's say net zero pledges, and I see TCFD, so the role of investors, also very important. So what this slide kind of puts into context is climate accounting from the lens of the planetary perspective, the UN world politics perspective, and then the sector that we could frame as non-state actors, and that's the companies, investors, cities, with more and more net zero pledges, but with very little accountability for how they're going to meet those pledges, and perhaps little clarity around the frameworks to provide that accountability and how that accounting comes in, and particularly systems that elucidate how that robust accounting translates into more clarity, more symmetry of information from the financial standpoint, both from financial risk, but also from financial opportunities. And all of that is extremely important so that we can finance all of the transformation and the climate actions, which is what happens on the ground, that are relevant. So that's kind of the context and perhaps the scope of the SIG to some extent. Hopefully that's helpful, Tom.
I think that is definitely the polished, approved version. It's absolutely correct. And I'd just like to add a bit more context, maybe with a Tom touch to it. I'll attribute this to my own perspective. Like the Paris Agreement, as Martin was just describing it, it not only sets the target of limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is translating into around 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide that can be emitted into the atmosphere. And even with, you know, the disruptions in economic activity that have been reduced right around the world significantly, we're still adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Concentration of CO2 keeps going up. But that 400 billion tons, when you have 8 billion people, that's only 50 tons a person. And that's over the next 10 years. And the average American for 50 years. And we know the nuclear bombs were only invented about 75 years ago. So instead of, you know, bomb, like every second, it's bomb, 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 bomb. And really in the last 25 years, we've had 25 UN COP meetings. It basically just be continuously bomb, bomb for like 25 years solid of blowing up in the oceans. That's how much energy just in the oceans, never mind everything else. So it's a significant challenge. And the Paris Agreement is really just the starting line. It's not going to solve climate change, and certainly not the long-term challenges that we're going to face in having to adapt as a society and an economy and so on. And so the challenge is not only 400 billion tons, how are we going to adjust with some new technologies? It's really like the World Economic Forum earlier this year identified as one of the top global risks that climate action failure was pretty much the top risk. People were simply not making the reductions fast enough, deep enough to avoid the catastrophes that are going to happen. And so that larger context is pretty gruesome. And so as challenging as it is to get to the Paris Agreement goals, that's just the starting point. It's nowhere near going to get us out of this pickle. So that's the size of the challenge. And to really fight climate disruption, we've got to bring in these disruptive technologies, and we've got to bring in these disruptive governance innovations, social innovations that can be enabled with the digital technologies. And so let's fight fire with fire. And so our mission of the special interest group is to really cultivate and foster this collaborative network, meaning climate experts, blockchain and technology experts, and other organizations to form this center of gravity around how blockchain can be applied in so many different ways, around generating the open source resources and software, protocols and tools to help address the global climate action challenge in terms of policy, the digital accounting. It's still a lot of work, and to integrate that into a global accounting system that supports a global climate solution system, really. Martin, I don't know if you want to add any points to the mission.
No, I mean, I would just add being able to bring in the existing Hyperledger community and the Hyperledger frameworks into their applications and uses for all this.
Yeah, totally agree. Would you like to talk about scope?
Yeah, with the scope kind of has been kind of helpful to frame what climate action, how we've framed like the difference between climate action and climate accounting. It's quite broad, and it needs to be quite broad because it's in many ways it's a planetary context. But I think one way we framed it is, climate action is everything that happens in the real world that we do. Either we finance something, either we create an adaptation measure or adaptation action, whether we do mitigation by forest-based or energy-based mitigation, but also our emissions are a form of action. Now, the accounting side is really the records of all that, right? So in many ways, I'm like this heuristic of action happens in the real world and accounting happens in the digital world, which is this one. If we don't have robust accounting, we're not going to be able to track who's doing what on the real world and how do we finance it. And that second part is key, is you have to have trusted digital records about who, what, where, how something was done, so that informs finance and informs accountability, right? And so that's, I think, something that emerged in the context of a SIG that's been quite helpful. And that's really the scope. Obviously, the digital side is where DLTs come in for IDs, for smart contracts, for ledger-based records, the role that IoT can have on gathering data, the role that machine learning and AI can bring sense making to that data, to verify something through a lot of statistical analysis, and therefore confirming a smart contract, taking the role of an oracle. This is where the exciting really part lives.
Martin, do you think, pardon me, some of the work that you're doing at the Open Climate Lab in terms of the ledger of ledgers, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about each of those ledgers and how you're trying to integrate them in your work, because I think that is very much what the SIG should also be working towards.
Yeah, sure, and thanks for that. And this is kind of part of also what this first early stage of the SIG is. How do we start bringing in very complementary projects that are already out there into the SIG's organization and activity? And in one of those it's a project that we started at Yale a couple of years ago called Open Climate, but it's basically around the notion of needing an integrated climate accounting system that really defines a framework of how our consensus around the state of the planet links with also our agreements, our global agreements, the relationship between state and non-state actors and the registries, the role of digital MRV, the role of climate markets, and the role of finance, and how records link to each other. And that fundamentally has to be a digital public good. And then the premise there, as Tom was saying, is not to have like one ledger to rule them all, and that really defines everything has to be go on the same ledger, but we're going to have to integrate a lot of the legacy accounting infrastructure that currently runs on national level registries or different level registries to all the suite of climate and blockchain projects and companies and startups that bring in a very important piece of the puzzle, right? The carbon credit tokens that we're seeing kind of left and right since the 2017. All of them kind of have a role within the Climate Change Coalition. So if everyone kind of does their own ledger and everyone's tracking their climate action, but no one speaks to each other, we really don't have that. So one side is evidencing that gap and then finding ways in which we bring them all together throughout common protocols and standards. That's what kind of Open Climate is about, and bringing in stewardship and integrating the the actors and doing some of the pilots to elucidate what are the first draft of those common protocols for everyone to agree on, and why it's important to do that. It's very similar to the internet analogies that if we don't all agree around a common protocol, let's say SMTP, then everyone's going to run their own emails, but I'm not going to be able to send an email to Tom because my emails are hosted in Google and his emails are hosted in Outlook. It's really the common protocol that drives interoperability. So that's a key part within that. And then within Open Climate, there's a very important kind of project that we've now kind of participated the SIG more into, which is the Open Climate Collaborathon, which is more of a grassroots initiative, a collective where different organizations have now joined to co-organize and lead forward so that we could create teams working on different pieces of that common puzzle being a climate accounting system, and then start having a participatory nature on how to say around that common architecture. And we launched the Collaborathon last week. We launched it last year as a proof of concept within the lab. This year it got spinned off. It's now more of an open collective. Launched it last week with the kickoff with some really exciting open climate dialogues. Tom was at the launch there along with Sue Binias, who was the lead negotiator for the United States in the context of the Paris Agreement and 30 years before that. And that led to some exciting working groups that started forming on the weekend. And the SIG was an ambassador to that. What ambassadors are to Collaborathon are kind of entities that broadcast these activities that are kind of grassroots and bottom up. But there's a lot of potential for bringing in more of these activities in conjunction and synergies, since there's a lot of potential for the Collaborathon to host working groups, teams, and prompts throughout the year with an outlook that was set up by the Collaborathon to say, in November, when we normally have our climate summits, can we convene all together to really drive a massive sprint, a global sprint around maybe a week or two. We can kick off with a virtual conference to bring in all the right experts to discuss around what should be, let's take the global stocktake, which is a perfect mechanism to discuss climate accounting, because it's how the Paris Agreement already has baked in these milestones to do planetary-based accounting that helps as where is every country at in regards to their NDC? How are we doing in regards to our 1.5 target? And then there's a huge role for an independent global stocktake. There's a lot more participatory, where everyone has, a democratic role within how we are managing our Earth system. And so this is a perfect fertile ground for us to summon efforts around kind of an independent global stocktake summit and meeting, and what are the type of tools and technologies that might be needed for that, so that this becomes a stage for a collaborative hackathon to happen. And so I'm really excited around our next SIG meeting so that we can discuss more around how we can sync these activities. Hopefully that was comprehensive.
Yeah, as usual, and that's the way it needs to be. The architecture for an integrated system, so the digital architecture reflecting the climate accounting architecture. It might, if you're not neck deep in the climate space, maybe you're blissfully ignorant. They have a lot of challenges without digital. The carbon accounting, whether it's data quality issues or completeness issues, and bringing in all of the other digital solutions that blockchain can work really well with, wonders to revolutionize the integrity and reliability, and in terms of investment decision making and so on, is like a big work in progress. And so I had moved the slides forward to an overview of the activities of the SIG, and Martin gave an excellent description of what he's doing and how it connects to so many other things. The directory of activities is kind of foundational for many of the blockchain and climate initiatives. There's a few going on around the world where they really would like to know more about what people are doing exactly, what state of success or progress are they at, and really drill down into some of the challenging issues with blockchain itself, even its energy consumption and its carbon intensity of some blockchains. I just read a new report by a joint report by the ITU and the UN that was released in the last few days. And sure enough, all too frequently, sort of the first mention of blockchain is associated with the excessive energy consumption and carbon emissions with some blockchain applications, not all. And so in terms of information needs, certainly, how do applications work or could be improved, but also looking at improving the sustainability of the digital solutions themselves is part of our responsibility, collective responsibility, to be sure that we're minimizing our own resource and energy consumption. So that's part of the directory of project activities and best practices and frameworks or approaches that people are used in order to not only architect the integrated system, but to optimize it in terms of its own performance. We've established, or we're in the process of establishing, some subgroups around standards and interoperability in terms of the first area or bucket of activities. And then some of the other ones, the knowledge exchange through our regular SIG web meetings, usually twice a month with some members. Just last week was Earth Day week, and there were a number of events, and so the open climate dialogues, that was I really enjoyed it, by the way, Martin, so thanks for doing that. And then engaging in other networks. Martin mentioned the Climate Chain Coalition. There's the International Association of Trusted Blockchain Applications. That's a pretty new initiative as well, and there's some others. So engaging with these networks and ecosystems to learn about some of the other solutions that bridge, for example, with the Hyperledger ecosystem. And then I think we're going to get towards some projects at some point that help to turn more concrete and tangible all of this cooperative work into live and breathing ecosystems that deliver tangible solutions and results. And so I think our first web meeting was in January. Did we kick off that early, or was it February?
It's hard to say. There's so much that has happened. It feels like it's been 5 years already in the course of 2020.
That's true. It has felt that way for sure. What's great to have seen the special interest group grow in the number of members that are joining, but also, as Martin had indicated before, there's all of the other SIGs and working groups in Hyperledger. I think we've had folks from energy, the capital market SIG, maybe education. So it's great to be able to cross-work with those initiatives and their solutions, so that we can leverage the work that they're doing into our mission and scope. Anything you'd like to talk about related to the activities, Martin, that we've either done or in the works, like planned?
Oh, it'd be great to hear maybe from the others if you have any questions. I don't know how many slides more we have.
That's it, really. There's just one more get involved slide. That's all.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's more like maybe questions around how to get involved, what's some exciting things coming up. I mean, I think we're starting to define and create working groups and getting members to run with them, working groups around standards, working groups around what are all Hyperledger frameworks that are particularly relevant for this, activities around organizing events, with the Open Climate Collaborathon and Open Climate Dialogues that we did last week. there's a clear blueprint that we could take forward and have more synergy between the SIG and the Collabothon to run events, let's say webinars and dialogues on the blockchain climate space. Maybe as soon as May, we can organize a couple of sessions. Definitely November is a great opportunity to start working towards. And so I think that having a timeline really will help the activities take traction. Yeah, it's really up to also opening up to the members of the SIG to propose. I think we've had maybe a bit of a shy bunch so far, but every now and then we get some very active members that propose something, and then it gets extremely exciting. So just one of the things that we've been kind of working on as chairs is part of us as facilitators, almost like neutral facilitators, and trying to get people to bring in the context. But naturally, both Tom and I are very kind of knee deep or neck deep in the sector. We are also we bring in a lot of content and structure that can help those activities running. And after maybe a month and a half that we've kind of laid it out for that emergence to happen, it's now time to maybe do a more proactive activity proposal. So I'm very excited to the next couple of weeks, inviting everyone here to join. Our next meeting is next Tuesday. Those happen around 8 a.m. PST. That's 10 a.m. Central Time. So I think that's relevant for Austin. And then there's a couple of questions I start seeing in the chat. I'm happy to start we start addressing some of these or opening the mic for people to ask. Not sure what would be the suggested way forward.
Yeah, if you can see him, why don't you go ahead and answer?
Here, Devin says, are you saying that there still needs to be architecture tested, researched, and worked on before a standard protocol is established? Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think that we can't say, look, well, here's a protocol to define climate accounting at a global level. And I think that there's a part of it that's always going to be, once we have a first draft, it's going to be evolving forever. Just like the internet, right? It's important to put something forward. I think if one tries to say, okay, let's make a participatory governance to define all standards and all protocols, and come up with all the working groups that need to define that, we'll warm up our planet before we figure out which one, how we got everyone, on track. And it was the same thing, in the early days of the internet. You kind of needed to have some form of traction and then start, deploying. It's really not necessarily the perfect one that's the useful. Is the one that gets the most adoption, and then you start, building and improving off of that.
What?
Yeah. So here's one of the questions is: do you feel that somebody like United Nations or other tech governing bodies should should push for the protocol? So that's a very interesting kind of sector, because the UN has its own constraints in terms of the politics and the accounting that it can do, because its constituents are mostly countries. And so what I envision is that would happen, or perhaps should happen, is there needs to be some almost like parallel ones, where one's broader, but that the UN takes a very specific one. In fact, the protocol for the UN is dictated by IPCC guidelines on how greenhouse gas inventories at the country level should be presented. And it's UNFCCC comes with its own protocols of how countries should do that. But it doesn't, and probably would not, do prescriptive protocols around how non-state actors like companies should do that. And I envision them doing that anytime soon because of politics involved. So that's the role for civil society and NGOs to take up more leadership on that. And that's the role for more independent global stocktakes to emerge.
Martin, there's one question I wouldn't mind addressing, and that's from Subsurin, if I pronounced the name properly. And the question is, with carbon accounting, what are ways on ensuring integrity of the data from the physical climate world to digital accounting world, for example, with oracles or other mechanisms. And I'm going to relate one of the projects I'm involved in, which is a pretty simple one, and that is in being able to capture methane emissions from a municipal landfill in order to generate, use that biogas, clean it up, generate electricity, so the methane doesn't get emitted into the atmosphere as a pretty potent greenhouse gas. And so it's a new installation. All of the activities related to the landfill gas capture, the flow rates, the concentration, any combustion of it, all of that is being tracked with internet connected digital meters. And in this case, they have programmable logic controllers that enable us to not only capture that information and perform the data QA, QC, but to capture it the way the carbon quantification methodologies prescribe the data should be captured when one is then doing the carbon accounting. So having the ability to connect directly to those meters certainly helps to address the integrity of the data, and also there's a cost to everything, of course, and doing carbon accounting has a pretty significant cost. To date, most of the carbon accounting is pretty shaky, to put it simply, and that's because the data, and I know Martin can relay some of the experience from his colleagues in the Yale space, that the data can be difficult to get, or it's outdated, or there's some sort of problem with the data. And then being able to perform all of the MRV procedures to obtain a high level of assurance, like very high confidence level, that there's no misstatements in the information or errors. That can run tens and tens of thousands of dollars just on a small project, never mind trying to do the whole national inventory and everything else. And so we set for ourselves the challenge of how can we do this climate MRV with higher integrity in terms of the provenance of the data and performing all of the MRV procedures, do it more cost effectively, and to provide greater utility to that data, which often goes in a multitude of pathways to different users, whether you're calculating carbon credits or you're looking at the national greenhouse gas inventory, what considers all activities, waste and industrial and so on, as well as Martin had mentioned nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which is really a grab bag of contributions. Could be strategies and programs and finance and actual technologies and so on. And so this data gets used in so many different ways that, or could be used in a lot more ways. And so being able to essentially take that data marketplace, have that on a blockchain system, and then layer on top the different applications, much like Martin was talking about with the ledger of ledgers. Hope that answers your question well enough. Another one here, another point here about methane. Smithfield Farms, 45% of their carbon footprint is from methane. They're looking at capturing it, the methane, and creating biogas for sure. The more of that's possible. And I noted the other example from Mark Morris about hemp and its ability to be a climate solution as well. Certainly that's the case. I don't know what they're doing in Europe, by the way. I don't know if you know, Martin, about in the EU, any policies on using incentives like carbon credits for industrial hemp production in the EU, and if that's the case.
Not that I know of, but I can. There's another question by Mark that I think I can use to talk a bit more about that, which is, what's the best resource of approach to begin incorporating climate accounting into an existing blockchain today, like start monitoring and using smart contracts to act on. I would say I would start by looking at what's the specific action, the underlying action, right? Is it using hemp for carbon sequestration? Is it capturing methane? So those are all like highly distinct. And then looking at what are methodologies out there that have been created for doing that. And then reviewing those methodologies and what part of those methodologies can be digitized, and ideally all of it. Once you have that, this is kind of like what would make the recipe of ending in the blockchain. But you start with the action, you look at the existing methodologies, you look at any body that is issuing any credits for acting and applying those methodologies, where those registries are living, and that might be either in compliance frameworks as well as in voluntary frameworks. And then it's really that question of like, what part of that methodology is already digitized? Most of it is not. How to digitize it, and then thinking in terms of, okay, how do I prove that that action happened? And then I make a third-party actor trust that. And so first is, what are all the evidence that I can gather that could be digitized? So what are all the IoT devices to show that? So if we're looking at either we're planting hemp or we are capturing methane, well, wherever the action is going to happen, we need to do a tracking of that area. So if we're planting hemp, it's like, what's the level of biomass within that polygon of land before and after? And so that's bringing in remote sensing to be able to make that analysis, those historical records. What's the methodology used to track biomass delta? What are sampling methods that are being done? And the blockchain comes into creating auditable trails of all that process of monitoring, reporting, and verifying those actions. Ideally, within one sort of set of methodology, working groups can start saying, well, we've identified that no one's really working on this, so we're going to start preparing the digital recipes that would bring in a high standard on proving that action was taken. And how are you also calculating what's your key unit of value? Is it like 1 ton of CO2 equivalencies being captured, reduced? In the case of methane versus hemp might be very different. If it's like, we're looking at hemp, how is hemp then being used after being that? Is it buried? Is it turned to biochar? Is it being used for construction? How do you deal with the permanence of it? Any forms of leakage? So there's a lot of methodologies around it. Those need to be starting to be defined. And if we think about smart contracts, we can think about that in terms of, let's say an IoT device is tracking, maybe storing that data in IPFS. Then there might be a multi-signature wallet that says, to confirm that this action happened, I need to pull in from the IoT device. I need to bring in a signature from an oracle that's going to verify that data and come up with the same conclusion. And we're going to also have a person, an auditor, that's going to provide a third level of signature. That auditor has the DID, which says it has the authority to do that, issued by some form of authority. It might be the standards body that's involved. Those 3 signatures within that multi-sig mints one specific token, and that's also recorded on a blockchain. These are kind of general archetypes of what we're seeing. Those are all, exciting and fertile areas for groups within the sector to start working on. And there's several ones out there, but there's a lot of work to be done. Hopefully that helps give context around how anyone thinks about running through climate action through this process. I'm gonna have to go soon. I'd love to just jump with questions in the chat. Happy to address them as they come.
Looking too.
Other than that, there might be a second part of this meetup that will go on afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Is David Boswell still with us?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah,
Hey, David.
It's interesting to hear so many questions. And if people want to continue the conversation, I would just say the special interest group forum and the meetings is the right place for that.
For sure.
Yeah, did we post in here? Let me post the wiki. Just so
That'd be great. Drop that link.
And that's really the best place for the information. Here's the link, and you'll find the meetings tab, and we'll post soon the meeting for next week. And hopefully we'll see some of the names here in our upcoming session or future sessions.
Great. Thank you guys so much. David, did you have anything else for them, or should I do the raffle?
Yeah, let's do the raffle. That's gonna be fun.
All right, everybody's name's in here. I'm trustworthy like blockchain, I promise. Okay, got a name. It's a Post-it note. It's very sticky. It is Samsurin Welch. Did I say that right? I think everybody's still on here. So I will send you the information on how to get to that. So thank you. Without anything else, everybody stay healthy and safe in these strange times.
Yeah, for sure. Stay safe, everyone. Yeah, and Monica, thanks for hosting. And I will post this on YouTube and send you the link in just a little bit.
We'll get the slides out to everybody. Thanks for spending some time with us, guys.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Nice seeing you.
Thanks, everyone, for the
Thanks,
questions.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.